Welcome to the special call meeting of the Danville City Commission. Today is Wednesday, March the 30th. The hour is 9:02, and I will call us to order. Today's agenda is one item. It's a beginning budget discussion. It's that fun time of year. We'll talk about year-end, year-to-date, and revenue forecasting. I want to take special note of our new financial manager, Lee Compton. This is her first time at bat. We look forward to what you bring to the table thus far. And with that, I will turn it over to City Manager Earl Coffey.
Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners. First, I want to talk about a couple things that's brewing real quick. Tomorrow night, we won an award with the American Society of Landscape Architects with the Downtown Master Plan. They're having their annual conference in Lexington tomorrow night. I wanted to mention that to you. I think the mayor's going to be able to try to attend. I'm
going to be there.
Josh is, but it's tied to the Downtown Master Plan. I will not be there Friday night. Another one is
that because it's Friday night or just Friday night?
No, this Friday night.
Okay.
There's a couple other things. We have a deadline for a grant on the 8th, and also Marshall is going to have an emergency budget spending request. So the question I would have is, do you all want to have a meeting Friday to try to get those things processed, or do you all want to add that to the 5th? And I just say that I would add it to the 5th. I just don't want to not ask how y'all want to.
How much is it?
It's just two items, and I think they can be fairly efficiently done on the 5th without intruding upon the hearing that you're going to have. If you just,
I'm in favor of that. What about you all?
Yeah, I didn't want to assume because it was a hearing. Then getting into the budget numbers, so I want Lee to be involved as much as possible in this budget process. So, and I also want to have her influence in the budget process. with us. So when we're talking about revenue forecasting, we won't necessarily do a lot of that today because I'd like her to participate in that more. But what we will do is talk about some of the concepts we did last year relative to response to COVID and whether or not we've recovered, and then let that guide us on how we look at going forward a little bit. And we'll talk about that today. Excuse me. So the first thing that we need to get caught up on is the monthly summary and then year-to-date summary. So you have on the screen in your first sheet is a report that of the general fund that shows our budget on the first column, and then the second colored column is the February actual year-to-date, and then you have to the right of that the monthly expenditures for each department and each major department of the city totaled then at the bottom of those columns as you go through. And so then on the top row, we'll look at our revenue, the total resources. You're trending towards of about $1 million to $3 million on average a month in terms of revenue is what that slide is showing you. And dialing into a single month, we'll look at September. In September, the city brought in $1.365 million in revenue to the general fund. And then, so as we look down below that, we have the various department expenses. Now, we have pulled capital out of the discussion for today totally. It's has quite a bit of cash flow and so many projects to it. We want to make a table out of that all by itself so that the capital doesn't impact your operating budget either. And it cash flows through multiple fiscal years, and even though the total project cost may not change, but it makes your budget look distorted sometimes. So we like to pull that out when we're talking about operations. We'll go down, we'll use the same month for legislative executive, starting there, $139,000 that month. Finance, $126,000 that month. All the way down to the total, subtotal for the department budgets is, for September, was $1,216,000 for, well, $216,000 round up. So then non-operating is non-departmental stuff and debt service. You'll see debt service paid that month. Down below that in the month of September was $44,000. So you'll see how each major department and each source of money is lined out per month. I hope that slide makes sense. I felt like that was pretty straightforward for you all to hold and review and start to understand our cash flow a little bit on a monthly basis.
Earl, let me back up to something I think I heard you say, and that is that capital doesn't really affect our budget.
Doesn't affect your operating budget, so that's.
But then again, it does, because if you have to allocate for interest and principal payback, that's money that comes out of the budget that we could use elsewhere. I'm not arguing that that's wrong. I'm just making the point that it does affect the budget.
Right, so debt service.
From an operational standpoint of view.
Debt service is in there, and so what we describe that as is the, for example, your lump sum contract, like with the fire station, it's $6 million rounding up. So we put all $6 million in this budget, right? Well, you're not going to spend that. You may spend $2.5 million after July 1st, right? So if you're constantly looking at that, and we put in next year's proposal $2.5 million, and this year's, when you're looking at the spreadsheet, it looks like that we're spending $8.5 million, and you're really not. You're spending $6 million. It's just we budgeted for it over 2 fiscal years, and so the net on your fund balance doesn't change. You're still going to spend $6 million, but on paper, if you try to roll those numbers into this spreadsheet for the presentation of operating expenses, and debt service and interest is included in this, then it just makes these numbers look weird sometimes. And it makes you have to constantly have context of your project.
Wouldn't we be more accurate, and I don't really want to belabor the point because I know we got a lot to cover, but wouldn't we be more accurate to adjust that $8 million number down to 6.5 so that we could really see what we had to work with?
You can, but that's why we want to pull that capital out into a separate discussion. When you're looking at our budget, for us to spend the $2.5 million or us to think about spending the 6, you have to budget for the total. So it really, the way the fiscal years work, you really can't manipulate it like that. You have to account for the potential expenditure in the year you're in. So if they fast-tracked the project and spent $6 million, if you would have tried to budget $4 million this year, then you would have had to amend your budget to finish the contract. And so you don't
And I
want to do
get
that
that
either.
point. Again, I'm now talking about, why do we continue to have that $8.2 million number when we know that the fire station's not going to cost 8.2?
Oh, in terms of the budget, that's all of your capital.
Okay.
That includes I'm sorry, you were looking at the actual budgeted number there.
Gotcha.
Right, no, that's all of your capital, including, Parks and Rec, or your fire truck, and
You've answered my question.
all your general fund capital makes $8 million.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So then let's look at some lines individually, and this is the interesting thing about the revenue that we were talking about. So as of February, you're 67% of your year. And in terms of taxes, our property taxes are 93% of their revenue, which is very strong. It's a little bit, we'll find out an analysis in a minute. But then the licensing fees was 96% of its total number. That's very strong. Service revenue, the service revenue is a little bit different. We've not billed that. So it's down around 15%, but some of that is our, like, 911 bill to the county. Some of that is us not having invoiced those that we provide services to, like Parks and Rec. We've not necessarily invoiced the county yet for some of those expenses either. Excuse me. So hopefully, when you're looking at that and digesting it, you can contemplate this information in that way so that you can start to see.
So on that invoice for Parks and Rec, if I understand you this correctly, we've not received their portion of the funding for this current fiscal year?
I'm suggesting what's in that number. So what out of the 1.164 million that we invoiced various agencies, we've only invoiced 169 as of February. We should have been doing that in the month of February, and so that will be a lot different by May than it is in this budget sheet.
Is that done quarterly?
It's supposed to be done quarterly, yeah. Yep.
Does that mean we send it at the end of the quarter and
Correct.
and it kind of is being paid in the next quarter
Correct, right.
instead of at the beginning of the quarter and then they pay it by the end of the?
We generally bill at the end of the quarter.
That's where you get the lag.
Right.
Okay.
Question, why should we not bill at the beginning of the quarter?
I do wanna
We
ask
can do
that.
that. That's just what we've always done.
I think that's the best way to do business.
I think it should be kept in the same quarter, if possible.
Yeah.
So just looking here, we're 1.3 million down for income or resources from what we thought we would be? Is that what that means?
No, we'll
What
get
we had
into that on the
budgeted?
next slide.
Okay.
We'll describe that a little bit more fully here in a minute. We're in what I would consider a strong position relative to where we're at in the calendar year. So you'll continue to have revenue. So the $19 million number was for the entire fiscal year. And so as of February, we're already at 17 million.
Okay, I thought it was budget 67% versus 67%. So we're looking at the actual whole budget. Okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
thank you.
So then on department expenses down there below, we're trending very well. As you can see against the 67% number, we're below that or right at it for every department.
Make note of the issue of community agencies.
Yeah, a lot of those, yeah, right. Yeah. We won't get into that too much, but yeah, we see that. Debt service is higher because a lot of your debt service is done the beginning of the year and then the middle of the year, January, February period. So that's a neat little slide. We felt like that we would like to do our monthly reporting doing a slide like this rather than summary table. I like this information personally. The next slide is taking a step back from that information and analyzing it a little bit. And so we've removed the monthly data, we've added some year data to the left, and then we've got 3 columns of analysis for you there so that you can think about it. Now, remember during the budget report last year when everyone was trying to figure out what COVID would do, we were, the very first column, the actual FY21 versus the percent of COVID, pre-COVID revenue. Remember that the economists had indicated to us that our goal as a society is to get back to like 90% of revenue by the end of the calendar year that we're in now, right? So the fourth column, which is actual FY21, which was how we ended up last year, and comparing it to the very first column, which was your pre-COVID revenue, is the percentages that are in that column that says actual FY21% of pre-COVID revenue, right? So the very first line is 113%. The second line on your which is the one that is really the one that economists are looking at, is at 98%. So then the actual revenue that we ended up with last year was $14,367,000 in net profits and occupational license, okay? So the very first column, which was FY19 pre-COVID, was $14,597,000. So as of the end of the last fiscal year, we had recovered to 98% of our pre-COVID revenue. What the economist was suggesting is that we would be about 87% at the end of last calendar year. We exceeded that. The economy outperformed that prediction, and they suggested too that in the calendar year we're in now, that you would end up at about 92%, right? So at the end of last fiscal year, which was in June 30th of 21, we had essentially recovered statistically from COVID on our occupational license. Now, some of that is pent-up demand, so we still think that's volatile, but I don't know that it's, we've not seen the same economists predict any strong opinion yet, which means to us that there's still a lot of gray area moving forward over the next 24 months. So it's kind of a rolling 24-month projection. So we're trying to figure that out so that we can more reasonably predict our revenue next year. But it is very strong. 98% of pre-COVID revenue was way ahead of what was predicted, and is a fairly strong recovery at that date, at that time stamp. So the end of the year, the next column is an end of year analysis for FY21, or end of year snapshot for FY21. It is fiscal year 21 projection that we had versus actual. So during the budget process, we estimated the year end, and so our fund balance carry forward in our budgeted column was built off that estimated fund balance. And so one of the important things we look at is how we actually finished against that estimation. So what we see when we go down through that column is that our taxes came in about $31,000 more than we predicted. The occupational license came in at $1.7 million more. As we go down through there, every line was positive, And so our total positive cash variance in terms of revenue compared to what we had estimated when we were doing our budget last year was $2,759,000. So we ended up with $2.7 million more in revenue than we were predicting when we were going through the budget process last year. So we started our budget year with $2.79 million more received than we were predicting. Does that make sense? Okay. So then, as we went through the projection on our expenses during the budget process, of course, we try to be, when we're doing the budget at that stage, we try, when we're doing our estimated year end, we try to be as accurate as possible on our expenses. We don't try to artificially inflate those. We just try to predict them, right? So what we saw is that we had an over in a couple of the departments and under in some other departments. The net was that we ended up $56,000 more than we predicted. So we ended up spending $56,000 more than we were predicting, which isn't bad on that level of expenditure. It's $11 million expenditure, so it was 0.5% off. And so at the end of the day, our cash position was $3 million stronger than what we were predicting when we were going through the budget process. So in other words, we came in under expenses, which saved some, and then we came in over revenue, which generated more cash in the bank, right? Three ways.
We were thinking,
Wait a minute, I'm sorry.
Earl takes 10% off the top.
Yeah, no.
I
So-
noticed on this, if I might interrupt just a second, that I've always maintained that our operating expenses have been pretty level for a long, long time. And I think this bears that out if you look back through the years. We don't spend a whole lot outside of capital and people and that kind of thing. We're pretty tight.
Yeah, we will try to do a chart that says that for you, that looks at that. You make a note on that. We can do that pretty easy.
And going back to talking about capital, you just pulled that out today for discussion purposes.
That's it.
It does,
Yeah.
it is incorporated in our overall budget.
Right.
Yeah, we're just not
Absolutely.
talking about it today.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a pretty good chart to look at, Kevin, that, we'll do that. It will be interesting. You'll see it very flat. This year, of course, with the step up of the police budget, for example, let's looking at the police line, we went from an actual expenditure, granted, we had a lot of we were down, 10 employees at one point that fiscal year out of the police department. As it cycled through, we spent $3.369 million out of that budget, and our budgeted amount this year was at $4.8 million. And remember that's reflective of two or three things, one of which is staff, full staff projection, and then also we adjusted in the comp study, right? When you look at their total expenditure right now, they're at 56% of the year. So we're going to blow through that $3.369 million number. So if you were looking at that profile of expenditures over time, this year would be a step up. It would be just an obvious step up because of the investment in personnel. Yeah. The next column, we did have the percentage there for you. So the $2.79 million meant we were 14% over our revenue projection in the actual receipts, which was strong. And then we were 0.5% over on our expenditures than what we were predicting. So that was solid. That was that the difference in those two numbers produces the net gain. So the next column is your FY21 year-to-date versus last year's FY21 year-to-date. And it's just something interesting for me to look at. I don't know that you all have ever evaluated that a lot, Normally, we just give you year-to-date kind of stuff, right? But it's interesting to look at. So the third column is where we were at in February of '21 versus February of '22, which is your blue column, right? And so as we go through, what was interesting there is our revenue on the property taxes was exactly, essentially the same, $32,000 variance this year under. But the others is, you can see the recovery of COVID in the occupational taxes. Last year, as of February, we had only brought in $8 million. This year, we brought in $13 million, right? So you have that's a much healthier inflow of what our primary revenue source, from our primary revenue source, right? And so that's a good shot too. What we feel like that column represents is a good shot of the impact of COVID. Now, there's a little bit of a nuance there. In the February of this year, you see a $2.4 million number down about in special purpose revenue, should be in that line or just above an intergovernmental. That is your ARPA money that was received. When I'm looking at the year-to-date to year-to-date, I'm ignoring that. I'm not including that because that is not recurring revenue. That's not coming back. So we're just holding that over there in the year-to-date column. But when we look at the year-to-date in February of this year, 22, compared to February of 21, we have a stronger cash position of $2.8 million compared to last year this point.
Earl, you've got that ARPA, if my eyes are correct, you've got that under intergovernmental
That's where it was booked into our system, yeah.
as opposed to special purpose revenue?
Well, because it comes from a government, it's an intergovernmental exchange.
Okay.
Yeah. So then so like I said, so to me, that's good. That indicates continued recovery, so that's a positive too, the way I look at it. In that column, in terms of expenditures, so we look at, granted, you have personnel, but you're looking at about a 9% increase in expenditures for this year compared to last year, right? And keep in mind, the CPI that came to us from Frankfurt was 7%. So part of that is employees, and part of that is just the rate of inflation. So we would anticipate, looking at that number, in addition to compensation, we'll have a healthier, probably 3% predicted increase in our operating expenses, not personnel, this year. So that will probably hit our budget a little bit harder. The inflation will, right? And now the next column is just an attempt at predicting where we were supposed to be in the budget versus where we actually are in the budget we are in, right? So, for example, in expenditures, we should be at theoretically at 67% of our departmental budgets. And so that last column is where we are actually, so it's comparing your darker blue to your lighter blue, right? And so what we are seeing is that we're under budget right now pretty good on our expenses, that's the biggest thing we can look at there. Revenue is exactly where we had predicted it should be based on the year-to-date. But the expenditures, the department heads are doing a really good job of trying to manage against the economic impact of inflation right now. So we're under budget on expenditures as predicted from the actual budget itself. Hopefully that makes sense when you go home and you contemplate it and reflect on it and come back with questions. Those two slides have a lot of information in them, a lot of good information in them. And it's really, for the general fund, we we can get into every single line item in the revenue side, for example, but just the trends and the overall view of revenue is pretty stable. It looks like it's recovered, and these slides try to communicate what that status is.
Earl, under the fourth column in estimated fiscal year 2021, at the bottom of that column, the bottom of the next column, and the bottom of the light blue column, those blue numbers represent what?
Yeah, so that was just me doing math. I should have had a description over there. That is the total operating expenses of 16 million, or revenue of 16,948,000.
Okay.
And so you're looking at the estimated year. Let's look at the actual year, okay? So at the actual year, the very next column of FY '21, the revenue we received was 19,700,000, okay? And our base, that is a number I use as just a basic operations test for me. And so then down there towards the bottom, our total operating expenses was 14,600,000. So then we, ultimately then, we had actually it was the operating expenses, I'm sorry, yeah, is 11, it's comparing the $11 million number. I was trying to communicate 2 or 3 different things there. So our basic operating revenue was 19 million. Our basic operating expenses was 11 million. So that meant we are bringing in above our basic expenses 8 million to cover all those other things like debt service, community service, everything else that are initiatives of the city. That is what I consider our basic operating float. Right? It's not to say that money's unallocated. Obviously, you got non-departmental expenses of 1.7 million out of that. You have your debt service is $1.5 million out of that, 1.2. So it's not to say that money doesn't have a need. I'm just trying to look at basic operating versus basic operating. I hope that makes sense. But I didn't. That was really for me. I probably could have not printed that, but that was just something I find interesting, and that's something I track personally, and always have. Does that make sense? Okay. So those are interesting slides. There's a lot of data on there. It's only 2 pages, but there's a lot of good quality information on there. What we will do is, what is difficult to explain is how hard it is, and Lee got a little bit of view of that this week, is for us with the way FE is, the archaic nature of FE, now that we're doing something just a little bit more modern, like with Paylocity, it's very difficult to get FE to do things that we want it to do.
What's FE?
Our financial edge software, our financial software, right? Is that fairly?
It's essentially a ERP database system.
What's ERP?
Do you know what Access is? Like
Microsoft
Microsoft Access?
Okay.
Yeah, it's essentially that on a larger scale, and all of the, data from 2012. I think that's the first year they started using it. In there, just pulling it out it's not efficient, or and sometimes it's impossible to get the historical data. So essentially, you have to go back to the paper copies that have been printed and then input those manually.
So we've done a lot of that, and we got it to the point where now we can manipulate it and do a lot with it. So
We're going to be going to FE.
no, we want to get away from FE. Yeah, we're
Going
getting
to
away.
what?
That is undetermined. There are several options out there. There's one that previously we had attempted to look at. I'm going to schedule a demonstration with them and what they can offer and provide, and ideally go to something more user-friendly and cloud-based, essentially, so that it is accessible, like if you cannot be here, but that is still undetermined. But
So-
it's
Yeah, so for me, when I look at that, the finance can't be a black box sitting over here that we have to go to lead to access, right? And so for me, we have to have a system, so a department head, so you've seen our last bill list, there's a lot of numbers in it. When we sign checks, you know how many checks there are. So each one of those is an individual transaction, which there can be data input errors, there's all kinds of opportunities. So the more eyes you have on that, the improved quality of your information, right? And so for me, what I'd like to see is if a department head wants to see where they're at today, they ought to be able to do that. They shouldn't have to run to finance. I'd love to get credit because, number one, Lee can't sit there all day and just print reports for people, right? And that information be accurate. So what we want staff to do is verify and validate information, not think out loud with a department head, right? We want those department heads to be able to think about that information on their own, and then therefore they have to be able to print reports on their own, they have to be able to analyze on their own, they have to be able to be a little bit, so therefore they have to have access to that information.
So are we gonna make that change
That's
coming up in this next
This fiscal year is what is our target. I'd love
Oh,
to do
this fiscal year.
something in the calendar year. We, it's been brewing for a while, but FE is just not, it's not report friendly, and it's not access friendly, right? It's just a cumbersome old system, right?
Lee, are you comfortable saying that the data you've seen since 2012 is accurate? Can you even make that judgment?
So essentially from what I've seen so far, I think historically on a big picture level, it is accurate. There are some, so like bank balance wise, that is accurate. There are some misposting issues that have come up in the last year and a half, 2 years or so, just because the staff doing it didn't necessarily know why they were posting the way they were posting, and we've always done something XYZ way, and maybe that's not necessarily accurate for this particular transaction, but nothing super egregious.
So for the public's benefit, what you said was misposting, not missed posting.
Yes, yes. So.
There is
you
a
know,
difference.
There is a difference, like line item versus line item.
Got it.
It's here instead of there, not it was missed.
Yeah, and FE, it's, so a couple things that we've talked about over time. FE is very difficult to just walk in and intuitively understand what you're doing, right? It's not an easy, so that 100% contributes. When you couple that with we honestly at the city hadn't done a good job of training staff. We just told staff blindly to do X, Y, and Z, and that's what they did until they were told to do something different. And for me, as an individual, I like an intellectual staff that understands what they're doing, understands why they're doing it, so that it's they can catch mistakes. If the more people that understand what's happening, the way better process you'll have, the way easier time you'll have, the more accurate information you'll have. And so that's our goal. Yeah. Software will help that.
So the software that was discussed a few years ago was never implemented?
No, it's not. So that's Cassell, and it wasn't all the way purchased. You've gotten into it. The company is giving us a few, when did we start? So time passes so quick. So in January of 21, we were really trying to get into Cassell and get them to implement it whenever we talked about having to quickly implement payroll. So then our focus shifted towards Paylocity and didn't begin with Paylocity, it began with Cassell. And as HR got into Cassell, what we realized is that we had purchased the minimum purchase. So you won't remember this, but the memo that was provided to you so there was this quick RFP done for financial software. and it had 3 or 4 vendors that had responded. The various packages from those vendors that was selected averaged probably around 400,000. Cassell was like 150. And so and Cassell then therefore got pushed forward, but what we realized in dealing with HR software solution last year was that you had to acquire additional packages or supplements to make the HR function actually work. And so we really didn't acquire enough of Cassell to really do what we need. And so the question is, if we do all the add-ons so that Cassell does what we want it to do, will it be 400,000 or will it be 6? And so then so as time passes, we got to that level of confidence right after we did Paylocity. And so as we processed that and turned our attention back to the full implementation of Cassell, so we went with Paylocity instead of adding that to Cassell because it didn't make sense, right? Financial sense. It was cheaper to just do Paylocity. So then when we circle back after that was done, like in September and October, it doesn't look like that Cassell, so then after October, for me as a city manager, I want her to be here before we make then that final decision, because it seems like to me that might not be the best option, right? I don't know that. It may be the greatest option ever. But alls I'm thinking is that for me, I probably should stop, and that was about in December. And so we waited until Lee got here, and we want her, because it's going to be software she's going to interact with on a daily basis. But more importantly, we want it to go with all the department heads,
And
right?
I do have a demonstration scheduled with them later in April, just because on their website is sales-based, so you can't really determine if it's gonna function for us or not, based on what I have seen, just looking at their website. So hopefully that'll give me a lot more insight into if it will function for our needs and for future needs, rather than just a
Will
slightly
it
better
integrate,
version.
will it integrate with
That's-
Paylocity that we
That's part of the
have?
question, I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And I had a question and I forgot it.
First thing you go.
Yeah.
Hopefully that makes sense. It seems like that takes forever, but it really is not. I mean, it happens, that's a pretty fast couple of decisions there
I remember.
for us.
It wasn't really a question, it was more of a statement. So in the past, the only person that had access to actual numbers was the finance. And so the perception was department heads were having to go to finance to ask permission for their own money.
That was not just the perception, that's kind of what happened.
Yeah.
But more importantly, not just that, what was difficult for me was department heads, we were asking department heads to manage their budget, and they couldn't interact with their budget on a regular basis. And so
Right.
for me, any given, so what, and bless Marshall's heart, he's got a spreadsheet where he's trying to track his expenses in the utility. That's a $10 million budget. That's not
Right,
easy,
right.
right? And to his credit, he created that, and he's in the department heads in his, so he is trying to, and I did the same thing when I was in his job. You have to make, FE is so cumbersome, and the way we do things is just archaic a little bit, like we need new software. You have to do that excessive investment of time just to be able to have control of what you're being asked to manage, set like that, what you're being asked to manage. So what we believe is having that real-time information will make that easier for everybody. It will definitely save time.
And then they can look at it and then come to you and help manage that, and if there's concerns or questions, they'll work with you. But then, like you've been saying for a while now, finance becomes transactional, which is the way it should be.
Advisory and transactional, it puts
Yes.
the
How about
finance.
transparency too?
It
Yes.
creates more transparency because you have more eyes on it. but it puts her in a situation where her time and expertise can be spent doing what she's really good at, which is analyzing, which is advising both the commission but staff in terms of, if you do this, it's always hard to think of an exact example when you're just trying to do it off the top of your head, but there's a lot of opportunity to utilize expertise of staff, but instead of spending all our time typing in numbers.
And Lee,
Right.
one of the things I'm real interested in is one person's forecasting.
Yeah,
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of room to go forward in that direction. There's not any software that we currently have for forecasting. Essentially, like what Earl's done here, what we can currently do will be essentially a Excel-based input data, and, you can get some forecasting tools that are essentially accessible to the public. And you can do a pretty good job of it. It's just more cumbersome.
But it becomes a swag.
I'm sorry?
It becomes a swag. You're looking at me.
A swag, I don't.
It's called a sophisticated wild blank guess.
Okay. I mean,
I've never heard that one before.
that's not the way they use swag these days, but that's a different term. That's how I.
You want to tell me what today's definition is?
She thought she was gonna get a T-shirt.
It's not bad.
I think my definition is more public-oriented and useful.
Yeah, it's not bad. No, forecasting, if you do it.
Swag is a good thing these days.
If you take into account historical trends and coming potential issues, or like inflation is one to look out for, it's, like, if you do a good job of it, it's not a wild guess. It can be pretty accurate in the sense of your stable type revenues.
Look forward to your work on that.
Mayor, could I take my first time out, please? I have three. I'm gonna take my first one.
You got three? Okay, this is the first half.
Well, okay, all right.
Okay. 5 it is. You just stretch. Became 10, so we'll continue on here.
You know, to follow up on that conversation, I would like to say this. Finance is not just a checkbook register.
Oh, yeah.
And we have treated it far too long like it was just a checkbook and we gave out checks. So
Well,
we've
this
had to watch-
commission has long since asked for forecasts and more information.
And so here, and I'll say this to the benefit of the public at large, one of the people that in my life that I've worked for one of the companies I work for, you know, and you all have heard me say this as individuals, but we'll say this for everybody. One of the things that was shared to me when I was young is that, look, it takes me 10 years to go broke, right? You've heard me say that before. It takes me 10 years as a company to go broke. And so as a city, we're the same way. And so forecasting is critical for us. So what's our trend and where are we going to be in 20 years, right? And so the degradation of communities happen in a much different scale than what we normally think of. So we look in terms of when our kids are in school. So we look in snapshots of windows of 3 to 5 years, right? That's when our focus and awareness, that's our time scale. Well, the city's 100, how long's Danville been here, right? 200 years, whatever. It's just a different, totally different scale. And so financial management for a city is a much different horizon than just a checkbook register. And I want to that's where we need to go as a community to understand our economy better, to understand our cash flow better in the long term, not in the next 2 years, right? 2 years is easy. What's it going to be 20 years from now?
That's what we've been asking for. Look forward to seeing the results of that.
Right. So then, so let's get in a couple more slides. So I took these slides. This is an interesting one. So we tried to communicate this data graphically, which is just a couple of your next slides. Number one, that's what happens with your revenue over the course of the first 8 months of the fiscal year that we're in. So it comes in and there's a strong dip. In 1 month, you get basically no revenue. Then it happens again. You've got property tax. When in November, whenever that pops up, you see that spike. And then at the end of the year, when net profits and things like that start to come in, and you'll have additional property tax payment, you'll see that big jump. It doesn't stay that way all year, and it's so we want to understand the cash flow of the city over the course of the year really is what we're trying to communicate with that slide. And it's just taking your total resources and plotting it versus time, right? And you see how wildly it fluctuates. Quarterly, really, but. So then this is that revenue compared to your basic operating expenses, right? So the first column is a bar chart plot of those revenue data points. And then we have our expenses. Our operating expenses are in red. Our non-operating expenses, such as debt service, is green, and the combination is the last one in purple. So then you'll see in October, you had debt service come in, for example, and your expenses went way up. And interestingly, that's your lowest revenue month. So we need to understand, we need to anticipate that, and we put money aside to make sure that that gap is covered for that period. So then in February, you can see it's the opposite of that. So what's it going to look like on into the spring? And it's going to look more like October. Right. And so we can look at that for a while and just think about it. But do you all have any comments or anything you want? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a simple bar chart, but it's interesting to look at. Lee really found it interesting, right? Lee, we will make fun, so I apologize for that.
I think this really is a good indication, because I think the misconception is that the city has a steady revenue all year long, and we don't. Just like any other business, you know, we have a busy season and a slow season, so to speak, and this
Is our busy season in terms
this
of
is
revenue.
going into our busy season of a lot of expenditures.
Now you're in the busy season, yep. It's the
And
opposite.
then we're gonna go into where we will have, a lot of revenue and lower expenses, so yeah. I think this is really good, I like that.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Is that increase in expenditures weather-based?
Well, spring, you're gonna do your beautification, your mowing, things like that start to kick in the spring, and you'll start to see a little bit more construction activity. The other thing is, we've been pretty conservative with COVID and reacted to that pretty conservatively. I know a lot of other cities did too, but I will say that I think that Danville is I talked to several city managers, some of which I'm friends with, but, we've recovered, did a pretty good job. I know there's a couple others that have too, but there's a bunch of others that are just not in that same cash position. And so we, as a group, as a team, Danville, as a government, reacted pretty well, and we were very conservative in our budgeting estimates over, like with revenue, for example, and so each one of those stronger than what we predicted, those are good things, meaning that we were conservative is what that means. It doesn't mean that we missed our guess, that means we were very cautious and very conservative.
When did we implement our comp study?
Last budget year was step one. We'll do another budget,
When did we adjust our expenditures, our salaries as a result of that?
in this fiscal year that you're in right now.
Right, what month?
August, July, August.
Then what's the jump in expenses subtotal in October?
That, if you'll look at that green bar, you'll see how it's pretty flat, and then all of a sudden that month, that green bar jumps way up. That's when you had a debt service payment that
I
cycle.
got you, okay, thank you.
So we were already in a pretty good position pre-COVID as far as overall. And then we maintained that and actually did better, even though we knew that, or we didn't know whether we were getting any of the ARPA money or anything like that. That was, we were in that, we had to maintain that position before we knew any of the COVID funds that we were gonna get.
That is correct. Yep. Yep. So the next slide is just your monthly variance. So it's just taking the blue line and your purple line and communicating that into one chart. So you're coming in positive, and then you had the one negative month. You'll have two break-even months. And so then the rest of the year would look a lot more like, hopefully, August, so that you do have some money above expenditures, but we don't anticipate February months coming from here on out.
Hey, Lee, and going forward, can you have a line drawn that is the mean of those different bars? Just to give an overall smooth out trend?
Well, you're not gonna like this next chart. There's nothing smooth about that. That's an EKG.
It's like a drunk spider to me.
Well, and that's just a chart of each individual department. You can see police obviously is the biggest investment. It's at the top. Fire's the next biggest investment. The difference there is probably just the number of people in each department. It's a little bit different. But they're fairly stable, and then you'll see, so the variation in those, rather than it being a flat line, a lot of times is, for example, when your medical bill comes due. And so one month you'll have a spike because that was when you paid your health insurance, for example. And then the rest of them are very similar. Public Works is interesting because you can see it jump up during the leaf season schedule. It jumps way up, and then through the winter it's higher, and now February, which is probably the slowest time for Public Works, which is your third highest line, and that's really the last one I'll dive into deeply. But you can see it's down, it drops down to a small number relative what is that, 83,000 is exactly what the number is for that month of February. But that's indicative of the weather we had, right, which is interesting to think about. A really bad one, you would anticipate a peak, like a real sharp peak if you have a real bad snow month.
For the most part, though, he did sort of a trend line, pretty flat.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do think it's interesting that information technology is the next to lowest
After what I said the other day.
expense. Yeah, and we
Yeah.
really need to change
Well,
that.
and that's a little bit misleading because a lot of the equipment or a lot of some of the support contracts and things are in the departmental budgets. So it's not,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. So
see,
it's actually bigger than that.
It's bigger
Okay.
than that, yeah.
But I still think we need to beef that up.
I'm not arguing
Yeah,
that point at
yeah.
all, yeah.
Like you said, technology is not going away.
No. It's interesting to look at, though. Proportionally to, you know, you can obviously see what the community's biggest burdens are with this chart, too.
But they're in the right order.
And what, in the correct order, absolutely. And then what actual services you provide. So you provide police and fire, and then public works, and then all these support functions. And I think their expenditure relative to the police and fire is proportional to what the actual expectation of the community is probably, and then also the actual need, you know. So then, the next one is, we're gonna get into the utility for just a minute. We'll do a similar analysis. The utility, keep in mind, is a break-even operation. That's our target. When I say that, meaning we don't wanna lose money, but at the same time, you know, there's not, you can derive a limited economic benefit from just generating revenue with your utility. It can hurt the economy if rates are inflated unnecessarily, right? So what we see is that on our operating revenue, the very first line, this is the monthly profile, the same way that we had with the general fund. Year to date, we're looking at about 66%. Versus the 67%. So our revenue projection on the utility is really essentially right on target. On the expenses, we'll skip down there. Non-operating revenue, real quick, is some of that is your debt service, for example, your KA loan. So unless you are getting that loan revenue in, that number isn't going up. And so it just, we don't really analyze that too closely. We look at that in the detail section. We don't, in terms of predicting whether or not you're on budget or not on budget, that number really doesn't help you, right, set like that. The operating revenue is the one that really tells you what's happening in the system, which is why we have that percentage by itself there. But down in the expenses, starting with utility admin, it's at 58% of the budget. The water treatment plant's at 68%. Now, we've talked about this before, but your water plant is your revenue, right? So if your revenue is coming in 10% high, you're going to be 10% over at your water plant. Or if your revenue is coming in 20% high, you're going to be 20% over at the water plant, right? It's just, you're not selling water if you're not treating water, right? So those go together, right? The water distribution is under budget. Wastewater plant, those are what I'd consider in a good place. Perryville Utility is right on target. That one is easy to budget because it's only $200,000 in total, so it's fairly predictable on a monthly basis. And doesn't surprise me that it's right at the number. Debt service, we had our payment in, which makes it look a little higher than what you would against the budget. So our cash flow for the utility is right at $1 million a month, plus or minus. And then our expenditures, our expenditures less capital for the utility is about can vary somewhere between 5 and $1 million, probably, but it trends closer towards probably 6 on average.
You got a line item here, pension adjustment, but I don't see any numbers.
That's a line that probably needs to delete it out of the spreadsheet. That was done years ago, and it's in our basic budget spreadsheet, but it was done years ago. So I could probably, I don't want to delete that line, so Lee and I was talking about it. Like, you have to work with that old spreadsheet that Daryl Blennis and I worked on it in 2006. So the spreadsheet that we have now is the same spreadsheet we built in. And so you can't delete lines out of it. You can't, you just have to hide them.
Lee,
Because, in 2009, we may have done a pension adjustment of like $2 million. But if you delete that row, it's going to affect your fund balance in your summary sheet.
Lee, it's an important number going,
That's what I was gonna ask.
Well, at the time, a spreadsheet was fairly advanced, we thought.
that may be a
Chiseled
real
it in stone,
important
that's
number
what I was gonna
going
ask.
forward, because about 3, maybe 4 years ago, the legislature mandated some significant adjustments. And I mean big dollars. And it wasn't just a one-time deal. So you need to chisel that out and find out. Now, that may have changed since the separation of the county employee retirement system, CERS, from the state retirement system. County retirement system is much better funded, so that may not be the issue as it was.
I'll definitely I haven't seen the most recent, I don't know if they're quarterly or semi-annually, we get reports from those folks. I haven't seen a recent one, but I will definitely
Do you know if that
find
report
that.
has projections, or is it just actual?
I think they do both, but I am not positive, and I can get back to you on that.
And somewhere, Earl, in your office somewhere, Ron had it. It showed the projected increase according to the state's numbers. Again, pre-separation of the two.
But I think the separation was part of relieving
I
that
agree.
obligation.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Still a big number.
Yeah. Anybody got any obvious things that just jump out at them in the way of questions with that? The next slide is some type of analysis of that. We did the same exercise, tried to include the same 3 columns to look at. We added a couple years in the backside, and then we did our comparison on the right. So the first column is FY '21 projection versus actual, which is your estimated year end that we were working from the budget, and your versus your actual year end on the revenue side. We came in with a total of $134,000 of revenue that higher than we were predicting. Our rate-driven revenue came in right at $40,000, say, less than what we were predicting at that. So that's pretty good on $10 million. That's pretty much a wash as far as we're concerned.
So those red numbers are good?
The red numbers are under, well, yeah, they're not good.
red numbers are
That's
positive.
necessarily right. That means our revenue came in $40,000 less than what we were estimating
Yes.
in February, March.
Yes.
Right,
Those red numbers are alarming.
yeah. So then, as we go down through our expenses, the department's heads, a couple of them were over and a couple of them were under or even. And so then the net cash variance at the end of the day was negative $144,000, meaning we ended up with on the utility side, when we closed the checkbook for the fiscal year, we had $144,000 less than what we were predicting when we were going through the budget process. So that's pretty good on a $10 million budget. That doesn't bother me necessarily in terms of that's good. That was a good prediction. That means as we went into the budget that we were going into, we were starting from where we thought we were, is all that means. I hope that makes sense. So the next column then is a year-to-date versus the previous year-to-date. What you'll see is here is revenue picking back up. So if you go to the actual, or the column that's labeled as of February actual, That was February of '21, and our year-to-date column is February of '22, right? So our revenue, our basic operating revenue is $1.2 million higher at this point than it was last year for the utility. So that means our utility is recovered as well as the general fund. I hope that makes sense a little bit. Is recovering along with the general fund. Then the departmental expenses are higher, which indicates inflation probably, and also your implementation of your comp plan. So that's predicted, that's not an alarming thing. We knew that would happen, right? So at the end of the day, there is your expenses over last February is about $300,000 more than you were expending last year, and you're bringing in base operating revenue versus base operating expenses about $800,000 more when you take the 1.2 million and subtract the 310,000. You're looking at somewhere between $800,000 and $900,000 more than or better than we were in February of last year, net. And that includes implementation of the comp study. So we like the position then in the fiscal year. We feel like that the utility is transitioning out of COVID positively. The utility has a lot of burden on it right now, system-wide. I know the staff can feel that. We've done a lot of good things. We went to monthly billing, which has been a big burden back here in this building. I think staff has transitioned to that. The field staff has transitioned to dealing with the cutoffs, for example, on a monthly basis. We went from having a month of 100 or 200 cutoffs to our months now look like 500, right? And so they've implemented things to pull that number down, which is the automated teller calls like Intercounty does, where it calls you and say, hey, your bill's due tomorrow, and it reminds you, right? And that pulls you off the cutoff list a lot of times. And so we're our cutoff list at the end of the day, when we're sending people out, when we're actually sending staff out into the field in a car driving to a meter, which is a cost for us, that's an expense for us. That number is down around 100 versus used to it was around 200. So we're pulling, even though we've gone to monthly billing, the net impact of that has been positive in terms of expenditure for us. So that means that those guys are doing water leaks, they're doing things that also will drive expenses down on the other side too. It's freeing them up to do those tasks. So it's an interesting transition, but it's a lot of work, would say, on the utility side. Give Marshall and that staff in the back, the clerks in the back, all of them, that's a lot of work, and they've had a lot of activity in this building to make that transition happen. The next column is just the year-to-date versus the expected year-to-date. Our revenue is about $42,000 under where we were expected compared to the budget. And expenditures, all of the staff were operating under budget at about a number of $360,000. So while our revenue is $42,000 under, our expenditures are $360,000 under. So a net positive right now, cash-wise, for the utility is about $300,000. I hope that makes sense. Yep. So then we did the same thing for the utility. We tried to do a few slides just to look at. This is the expenses on a monthly basis. And you can see your obvious largest expense is the water plant. Your obvious second largest expense is really a blend between water distribution and wastewater. So all of wastewater plant, all your, the water distribution includes the meter reading and account maintenance, right? Which you have, that should be a pretty good expense, not just line maintenance. October, the water plant in August, September, and October, that should be your highest cost months, because that's a period when the lake turns over from a water quality perspective. So you know how the lake, we've talked about the lake stratifying. You've got a hot water on top. So as as summer fades, the lake turns over and you get an influx of that, the dirtier water on the bottom mixes, and so it chemically, that is when our largest chemical demand is in that era of the year. So that means that cost is going to jump up for that period. It can happen again in the spring, just not as violently. Hope that makes sense a little bit. Yep. So then this is operating revenue versus total expenses. So just the basic rate charge revenue is in this sheet. So are your basic rates covering, and there's other expense revenue too for like service work and things like that. So is your basic rate-driven revenue covering the expenses? And generally speaking, yes, with December being the debt service impact.
So these are not labeled. Is this water only?
This is water. Yeah, this is utility. Sorry. I could have done that.
And
at
then
the
is
top.
the next one going to be
They're all-
sewer?
These slides are all utility, only utility.
Operating. Oh, okay, gotcha.
You're right. So the operating revenue is just the revenue you receive for the cost of service on your water bill, your unit cost of water, which is important for on the utility side. The next slide is total revenue versus total expenditures. And the total revenue includes service work, includes some of that cost plus work we do. And so those numbers are included in this chart.
Again, that's for water.
This is utility, yeah. So your utility looks strong. It looks to be in a strong financial position, but you got to keep in mind, we have a lot of expenses coming your way, right? And so we're looking at alternative ways to pay for some of those. And, you've got a significant sewer improvement project out Lebanon Road, and you're looking at the financing for phase 2 on the wastewater plant, which is a capacity upgrade. The first phase is well underway. I'd love to get you out there with Marshall and get a site visit, so you're welcome to schedule that. And so you can kind of see the progress firsthand to understand, it's kind of like the water plant. It's hard for folks to understand why it's $10 million or why it's that $13.5 million. It's expensive, and it's big stuff, and it's big footprint stuff. And I don't know how else to describe it, but then we are, over the last few years, you are pushing your capacity at the plant. And so we were trying to break it up in 2 phases, trying to push the capacity upgrade for that facility as far into the future as you could, right? As long as we can make it reliable, and those are, but that capacity demand with industrial development it's shortening that time period up to sooner rather than later number, right?
Now, on
so
these
we'll-
2 charts, to make it clear, because Jenny raised a great point, when you say utility, this is water and sewer.
Water and sewer combined, yeah. The next slide is just your variance.
Bless you.
So the revenue generates a positive variance other than when debt service hits. And then that positive variance on the utility is important because that pays for our operating capital and our capital. So you've got to think about, not just the wastewater plant. You've got the water line out Parable Road. You have various pump station projects. You have all that infrastructure to maintain. So that positive cash position that appears in that chart covers those expenses. So that's really it for today. I wanted to make sure that you had the main 4 sheets, which is your spreadsheets. And then think about that as time passes. We'll come back with the next meeting with more information, estimated year end, things like that.
I have a suggestion, Earl.
Yes, sir.
And I'll reference Commissioner Holland as a new person. Actually, it's your 2nd year, but as you skip to numbers, I'm going to suggest next year you get an old-fashioned stick pointer
Oh, yeah.
and just stand up there and point to the number, because you can't use what you're getting ready to use because you're not steady enough in your hand. Nobody is.
I should have used this though a little bit along the way, and I had it right in my hand and didn't. I apologize.
Because
Somebody yell at me and
you
say
may have
something.
some new
sometime.
members on the commission next year.
Who's in charge here? Yeah, somebody do something.
Yeah.
I was literally holding that in my hand. I don't even have to aim hard
Well,
to hit it.
you know these frontwards and backwards, and you
It's-
did jump around a little.
I did jump around, yeah, you're
We're having
right.
to keep up, so.
Yeah, I'm talking about this column, not this one.
But I wasn't gonna tell you that in public, but the mayor did, so.
Yeah, that's fine. No, it's always hard. We
Gotta keep up there.
we live with it, and so it's easy for us,
Swag.
and we say this
Swag.
lovingly, it's easy for us to remember old conversations and not repeat things that we think that you should just remember, and we do it every day, so it's easy for us to just think that's firsthand knowledge, and sometimes we have to remind you of a conversation we had last year, and that's fair, or yesterday.
And in spite of those comments, Earl, I think it was a great presentation, great start. Continuation of what we're trying to do, so good.
The budget process, we'll be on that schedule. We've gotten a little bit of a late start where we were trying to cram in that joint meeting. That didn't work out. We got delayed there a couple weeks with former Mayor Hunstad's
But we're gonna move forward.
passing. We are right where we need to be, though. We have our information. We're going to meet our schedule. So we're not delayed in our budget process. We normally get started a little earlier in this presentation, and then you'll have a little bit of air in between meetings, and we still kept the same endpoint, but we're,
Have you got a date in mind when we're going to move forward on this planning and zoning issue with
we're-
the county?
we will have KLC's contract with you at the next commission meeting for y'all to look at. I don't know, really, I've not gotten feedback from the county yet as far as what their desire is in terms of participation.
Yeah, I'd want to know what the planning commission thinks and what the county thinks. At least I would.
Well, we've met with Steve Hunter, and he, we're gonna work together on that, right? Like, we want, there's, that's necessary.
So Earl, you're gonna present a contract to us from KLC.
Right.
What are we to measure that against
The,
in terms of not only cost but services?
you can do an evaluation if you want to. Well, we talked about that last time. When you're doing an RFP, you're looking at the qualifications and those kinds of things. So when, you've got one entity that says, well, we did work for, Marion County, another entity said, well, we did work for Washington County. So, how are you ever gonna judge that, right?
Fairly simple. You put it out there in RFP like we do for Palmer and others that we just voted on, and we look and see, okay, these are the two prices, that's easy, but what is involved in those prices? That's where the value either comes
I
in or
really,
doesn't.
and two, I've heard some scuttlebutt that KLC's not effective in doing that. And I would suggest that KLC is extremely effective at doing comp plans. They do it every year. They're in high demand for that work, partly because they are affordable. And I've heard that rumor flippantly being tossed around that their staff not necessarily as good as other consulting teams. They consult as much as anybody else. So they are experts in the industry. They do have experience in that industry. They do it every year for multiple communities. And so it's not, I have heard, or as it's circled back to me, that their expertise is being disqualified. And I would question, why is someone doing that to us, right?
See,
And so,
I
rather
don't
than,
know how to compare that at all.
well,
And I think that's what we need to have, is
Right,
something
right.
that this commission can make an informed decision.
yes, I understand that. And one of the things I should have done is send you the link that they have of all the other work that they've done that you can just, just like another company would have.
Yeah, send that link. I went on their website and saw their questionnaire. I made a copy of if you want to see it. I thought that questionnaire was excellent.
Yeah.
So,
And my point has always been, I don't think we utilize KLC enough. And I guess they're just as able to look at any RFP that we put out there.
A lot, consulting firms hire staff from entities like KLC to do work like this for cities.
Right.
KLC staff, so while the number is less, to say that, the newspaper article talked about Frankfurt and Franklin County's investment to do their comp plan, about $250,000 per entity, so about a $475,000 contract. So KLC is offering the city's portion of that at $30,000. Well, they're able to do that because they're a nonprofit. They're not looking to cover their overhead expenses. Now, then too, you got to understand what the comp plan is. And so do you want, we are not asking for an expert to come in and tell us what to do. The comp plan is for your planning and zoning structure to be effective, your community has to have buy-in into that document, right? So the number one thing in the comp plan is not to have someone tell us what to do, it's to have the community's voice heard and to have them get an understanding and acceptance of future zone changes, right? And having someone come in to say that doesn't always, so the key is KLC has a terrific rapport with how to gather that information and how to participate in that public process. But to your point, we need to demonstrate that they'll love our expertise to you, and we'll do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not gonna.
how long does the RFP take?
It can take 21 days plus the review process, so it usually adds about 60 days to the process.
I mean, I think
45 to
KLC
60.
is very good,
Right.
and they do things at cost, which is great for the taxpayer. But I wouldn't mind seeing an RFP either. It might give the county more time, because I'd want to go forward with everybody on board. That's just me.
Earl, according to my calendar, the next budget meeting is scheduled for the 14th of April.
That's what I have. I know we changed it several times, so I want to make sure.
Yeah, so let's look at that together. Yeah, so spring break is next week.
Yeah.
We're looking at the 14th. And then we meet pretty much several weeks in a row after that with only one gap.
And then are we going to meet with Mr. Boyd this morning as well? Is Randy coming in?
Yeah, oh, yes, yeah. For the open
I
enrollment,
have
yeah.
9. Is that 9 a.m. on the 14th? I'll
Yes.
try to write that down.
11 a.m.
And thank you, Ashley, for texting us reminders. I need those, so, thank you. Well, especially when it's changed 3 times.
Oh, I agree. No, that's why I asked. 'Cause
I changed it when I did that.
I know, my calendar's chopped up too.
Yeah.
You know, we agree that got a little bit hectic there. Yeah, so the 14th at 9 a.m., and then we will meet pretty much every week after that but one until we're done.
You can come at 11 if you want, but the rest of us are going to be here at 9.
Ashley's in charge.
Yeah, Ashley tells us what time to show up.
Earl, this is nice work. Lee, this is great work. Thank you. It's a wonderful start to where I know you're gonna end up, and the commission as well as staff will be much better informed and won't feel like we're traveling down the road with no headlights on.
As will the public.
Yeah, and I was going to say before we conclude that compliments to the city and county and all of our supporters, because this shows they appreciate the services that the city provides. So even during COVID, they stayed with us and as much as they could, paid for the things that we were offering them. So I want to compliment the community as well.
Anything further? Did he? Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I'll move to adjourn.
We have a motion, is there a second?
Second.
Second, all in favor, say aye.
I,
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carried.